This segment of the Chapter 11 lecture is titled Slave Culture, and the focus question is, how did family, gender, religion, and values combine to create distinct slave cultures in the Old South? Slaves never gave up their hope for freedom or their will to resist total white control over them. They succeeded in creating a semi-independent culture centered on the family and church, which enabled them to survive the experience of bondage without abandoning their self-esteem and to pass on to other generations values that conflicted with those of their masters. Slave culture drew on the heritage of Africa. African influence appeared in dance and music, forms of religious worship, and slave medicine. The end of the foreign slave trade helped foster a particularly new African American culture, shaped by American and African traditions and values. The family was the center of slave community. Because of a natural increase of the slave population, in the United States there was an equal ratio of male and female slaves, allowing for the creation of families. While slave marriages were not legally recognized, masters had to consent to them, and marriages were often significant events on plantations. Most slaves stayed married for life, if not disrupted by sale, and families typically had two parents, although the sale of male slaves created a higher number of female-headed families than in white families. The threat of being sold, thus disrupting families, was the slave owner's greatest weapon, and fear of being sold pervaded slave life. Many men and children were separated from families by sale, but so were women. Some masters simply ignored slave families when making decisions about selling slaves. Furthermore, slave traders gave little attention to preserving family ties. In some ways, gender roles for slaves were very different from those in the larger society. Slave men and women were equally powerless. The cult of domesticity relegating women to the home did not apply to slave women. Slave men could not provide for their families, protect wives from physical or sexual abuse by owners and overseers, or choose when and how their children might work. However, when slaves worked on their own time, traditional gender roles prevailed. Slave men worked outdoors while slave women cared for children and cooked. The slave family remained central to slave culture and allowed slaves to transmit their values and traditions and strategies for survival from generation to generation. A distinctive form of Christianity also helped slaves survive and resist bondage. Slaves participated in the religious fervor of the Second Great Awakening. Every plantation seemed to have a slave preacher, often with little education but considerable oratorical skills and knowledge of the Bible. Urban slaves often established their own churches, but masters used Christianity as another means of control and discipline. Some required their slaves to attend sermons reminding slaves that theft was immoral and that servants should obey their masters. Slaves transformed the Christianity they had embraced, turning it to their own purposes. Blending African and American beliefs, slave religion was practiced clandestinely on plantations. The biblical story of Exodus, in which God chose Moses to lead the Jews out of Egypt into the Promised Land, played a central role in Black Christianity. Slaves identified themselves as a chosen people who would be delivered from bondage in time, while Jesus stood as a personal redeemer who truly cared for the oppressed. Other figures from the Bible that overcame oppression were important to slave religion, and the Christian message of brotherhood and equality of all people before the Creator irrefutably indicted slavery in the eyes of the enslaved. Slave culture rested on slaves' belief that slavery was unjust and their yearnings for freedom. Despite pro-slavery arguments, slaves understood that they were being deprived of the fruits of their labor by idle planters living lives of luxury. While most slaves knew it was impossible to directly combat their condition, this did not prevent them from desiring freedom. Furthermore, many slaves acquired knowledge of the outside world, both local and national, despite owners' attempts to prevent them from doing so. Slaves constantly talked and dreamed of liberty, and their actions during and after the Civil War flowed from their experience of slavery and their hope of escaping it.